And so you have this kind of Frankenstein piece of software that you're building and trying to maintain, and that inevitably will lead to errors in the structure and the integrity of the spreadsheet, which are going to give results that are misleading when you go to interpret them. So it's really interesting, this kind of concept of autocomplete or have an AI guess the next word or the next action that should be done in the form of a suggestion. Let's say that you're a manufacturing company and you do a lot of business at a port and that port gets flooded. The AI that you're using should be able to deliver a detailed explanation of this cascading set of effects.
Hello and welcome to Tech for Finance, where we help finance professionals leverage technology to level up their lives. I'm your host, Adam Shilton, and in this episode, we're chatting with Adam Tzagournis, founder and CEO at FlowCog, who make SaaS financial projections easy. After starting his career as an associate at PwC, Adam went on to become a senior accountant at Halo, then the finance director for Stack Overflow, who are the largest online developer community, before then founding FlowCog. Adam is also a developer himself and writes about everything SaaS related, modeling, metrics, FP&A, and more. And in his spare time, he likes to spend time with his wife and 15-month-old and has been studying Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with his wife for the past 3 to 4 years. So watch out, everyone. Before we start, if you like what you hear today, please make sure to subscribe to Tech and Finance on your favorite podcast platform and on YouTube. So thanks for joining me today, Adam. It's great to have you on.
Yeah, great to meet you.
Fabulous. So over to you then. So tell us a little bit more about where the inspiration from FlowCog came from. I've not heard of a huge amount of people that used to be finance directors, but then go on to be developers and develop sort of SaaS tech companies. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about your journey?
Yeah, I was kind of scratching my own itch. Over the years, I had taught myself programming in various capacities, even as far back as when I was at PwC. And we're in busy season and the audit team is there late at night. If you can find a way to save everyone even a little bit of time, you're doing a lot for your team. Everyone gets a little bit more sleep that night. So I started creating macros in Excel and Visual Basic. And from there, over the years, it kind of snowballed into me teaching myself Python and JavaScript and a programming language called R, which is used with statistics. So it's kind of an unexpected journey or path to becoming a developer. And along the way, I had various side projects. And even during my kind of full-time roles throughout my career, I had always done consulting on the side. And a lot of it was financial modeling, and most of my clients were SaaS companies, a few manufacturing companies here and there, but for the most part, SaaS. And I very quickly realized that whenever I had either inherited a model or was asked to create one from scratch, there were a few problems with it, right? One problem is that whenever you inherit a financial model and you start digging through what the previous person did, chances are that you're going to find either some errors in it, some hard-coded numbers, some circular references, formula errors. I saw this interesting stat that said that 88% of spreadsheets have errors in them. And so that was my experience every time I inherited a financial model. And the kind of other problem with it was, even if there weren't any explicit errors with it, it was hard to get insight from the spreadsheet. It was hard to actually get something out of it to really kind of have it be actionable and to help in strategic decision making, right? And so I realized that, okay, well, the problem is that if it's that difficult and there's not much, the fruits of your labor are not that valuable, and it's clunky to update, you're probably not going to go through that exercise very often. And then what ends up happening is someone builds a financial model, they don't revisit it for 6 months, a year, what have you, and the projections are so stale that they're basically irrelevant, and you're not using it to make decisions, and you're kind of flying in the dark there. So I very um, quickly realized, okay, I'm encountering these same problems over and over as a consultant. And I've done enough development work at that point. And I kind of realized, okay, let me try my hand at running a startup and seeing if I can build a tool that makes it a lot easier for people to do financial modeling and actually gives them more insight than a spreadsheet would. And a couple kind of challenges that I had come across with that was one of them was that at first the product itself was a spreadsheet with kind of a software layer in it. But when you go to set up a product like that for someone and they see a spreadsheet that they didn't build, now you're asking them to inherit a spreadsheet. And if the person hasn't spent their entire careers in spreadsheets and they see more than a few tabs, it's a challenge. And so instead of having someone uh, either rebuild the logic from scratch or have to understand all of it, um, I figured, okay, what is the kind of easiest and quickest way to get someone up and running with a financial model and to actually get insights from it, right? Because that's the big picture that I think a lot of folks, when they go through the exercise, regardless of what tool they use, they sometimes get lost in the details and forget the overarching goal of actually getting insight and interpreting their projections to help them make decisions or to help uh, that finance person support the founder, the CEO, and them in making decisions for uh, how to best grow the company in an efficient way.
It's interesting. And I think the relevant point here is not just, making it easier than a spreadsheet to build a forecast. Appreciate there's a big business case for that, right? But we're also talking about pace as well and speed, because if we look at the ways that things can change, whether it's a global pandemic or a recession or fill in the gap, it's almost every other month now that we're having to re-review what we're looking at, right? And we don't want to have to unpick a spreadsheet that took 6 months to build to be able to make a quick decision based on a variable, I guess. It's a slight change. The question I have for you on moving into becoming a developer, do you think working at Stack Overflow helped you there, or do you think you would have done it even if you hadn't worked at Stack Overflow?
I think I would have done it even if I hadn't worked at Stack Overflow. Obviously, I love the product. It's a fantastic community that's been super helpful in my own journey as a developer. It is encouraging to be around other extremely intelligent folks that worked there and that encouraged me to help nurture that curiosity that I had and to continue kind of building out that skill set. And it was very helpful in various capacities as well, in terms of being able to retrieve data myself and analyze it and present it and kind of pipe it into a consumable format for other folks as well. So yeah, I do think it certainly helped, but not strictly a requirement to becoming a developer. There's a lot of different paths to get there. So
Yeah.
there's not one right way.
Very good. Very good. And you mentioned a point previously as well about, you know, not everybody having the experience or the amount of time building models in Excel to be able to interpret somebody else's Excel model. There's I'm hearing more and more now about low code,
Mhm.
and that whole principle of, in theory, leveling the playing field. So my 30 years developing models in Excel shouldn't stop somebody who's maybe more junior in a role being able to generate similar results just with I guess an easier to use platform. The trade-off is that, platforms are going to cost money, and maybe people with 30 years worth of Excel experience, Excel's free, right? But if it's not accurate, then there's a question mark over how free it actually is if it's not saving you time and money, I guess, at the end of the day. So do you think we're going to see more of this sort of low code approach given sort of current skills shortages and all of that sort of stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question, and kind of the problem that I see is if financial modeling is not your full-time job, if you're a finance person at a software company or at any company, you have other tasks and responsibilities aside from just updating and maintaining and building the model. And that means that you don't have 1,000 hours of free time to be able to put into a model.
Yeah.
And the problem ends up being that a spreadsheet is in reality just a piece of software. It's kind of like a watered down programming language. And so if you're not thinking like a software architect when you build a financial model, you're probably going to get a product or a result that's not easy to update. There might be technical debt in it, right? That's a concept from software development where you built a part of the spreadsheet to apply it to spreadsheets a while ago, and now that module or that sheet or tab in the spreadsheet is no longer relevant or doesn't fit well or flow well into the rest of the model. And so you have this kind of Frankenstein piece of software that you're building and trying to maintain. But because you didn't approach it from, first principles of software development, you're on a shaky foundation, right? And that inevitably will lead to errors in the structure and the integrity of the spreadsheet, which are ultimately going to give not only no results to interpret, but even worse, they're going to give results that are misleading when you go to interpret them. And that's kind of the big danger in it. Um, so I do think that instead of asking everyone to become experts in spreadsheets, uh, just like you wouldn't ask everyone to become experts in writing their own accounting software every time they needed to go, record a journal entry.
Mm.
You should have a tool, and doesn't necessarily need to be my tool or any tool in particular. It could be a spreadsheet that has this kind of low code layer in it where the building blocks that you're using are a lot easier to number one, to build and implement, but also to interpret if someone is handing that product off to you. And so I think those are the kind of big issues that I see with how existing workflows are in companies where you're asking someone that doesn't have 1,000 hours to go and build basically a software product, right? And that's an unfair ask for them. So it's no surprise that as a consultant, when I go in and I look at a financial model, I see uh, either explicit errors or a spreadsheet that's just not very user friendly and difficult to use. Um, but yes, I do think that eventually, uh, with low code, you can abstract away some of the more challenging aspects of building out something like a financial model and get to a place where it's a lot more user friendly to either build it or interpret it.
Mm. I asked these questions, and it's as with you developing your company, it's to scratch my own itch, because I don't have a financial background, quite transparently,
Mhm.
so when you look at my sort of potted history, it started in music, went into selling houses, then it went into, I've been all over the place. But tech and finance was the bit that stuck, right? But I don't have the 10,000 hours of, posting credits and debits into, as you say, an accounting system. Um, so it amuses me asking these sorts of questions, because at some point it'd be good to be able to do some sort of challenge that says, right, well, let's take three people that just don't have a finance background, right? And let's give them best in class low code tools and see what they end up with. And I don't think we're a million miles away. And I think a lot of teams are probably thinking, oh no, nobody will be able to do it, because it's a threat and it's scary, right? I think, you give people the right tools, and it's funny what results you end up seeing.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that because I think as technology progresses, I think we should raise our expectations of the user experience of software tools in general, right? Not just finance, but finance, FP&A tools, financial modeling tools in particular as well. You shouldn't need to be an expert to use these, right? And when I built FlowCog, I had the end user in mind as a kind of this customer persona of a founder who is busy. Maybe they don't have time to build a model from scratch, but they need projections to help run their business, let alone for board meetings and pitch calls with investors. And so, how can I make this tool easy enough for them to use and to actually get through pretty quickly without investing a ton of time, right? And so, I think the quicker and this kind of concept of time to value, right? How long does it take someone to use a tool? And do they need to be an expert in that field in order to use the tool in the first place to actually get value out of it, right? And then there's this kind of concept of not only the time and effort and brain power that you need to put into the tool, but what do you get out of it on the other side, right? So, in principle, as technology advances and we get better and better tools and they become more useful to us, we should be able to put in a relatively small amount of data, effort, brain power, time, and on the other end, get out more of all of those things, right? It should be, this machine where the inputs are or the outputs are greater than the inputs. They're greater than the sum of the parts. And so you should be expecting, and I think this will happen in the next few years, as especially with kind of generative AI and all that, being able to have an output of a product, whether it's a financial modeling tool or any software tool, where the amount of time and effort that you put into it pales in comparison to the actual insights that you're getting out of it. And again, it shouldn't require you to be an expert in it. So, I like to think of this kind of funny concept in product development of like the user is the final boss. And so, when I'm building my product specifically, I can speak for myself here. I want to build a product that's easy enough for someone like you to use that is not that doesn't have the 10,000 hours of modeling experience, right? You should be able to look at the tool and understand it in plain English and enter in your numbers and do what you need to do and get something out on the other end that's useful for you and not require you to be an expert, not require you to give 100 hours of your time in order to get something valuable out.
No, I'd agree. And I mean, talking about your persona there, the company founder that's wanting to obviously model some projections and that sort of thing. I'll say something controversial now because there's a lot of talk about, finance business partnering, how do we communicate financial information to non-finance professionals and so on and so forth. I say it's controversial because I don't necessarily think you need a finance background to be a good finance business partner. I think you need a good grounding in business, and I think you need a good understanding of the different component parts that make a business work. And 100%, you need to know how finance works. Don't get me wrong. But I don't think you need 30 years worth of prior experience in finance to be a good finance business partner if you're able to demystify and provide guidance to other members of the company. And it's tools like this, that help you do that, right? Because you can immediately start producing results based on imagined scenarios, I guess. Anyway, so I'll let people fight over whether my words are true or not, but we can.
I actually I do have some thoughts on this as well. I agree with you in large part. I think to frame it as a modeling problem, right? The effort that you're putting in and your technical chops in a finance role can only get you so far before you run into the other inputs in the model, which are the conversion rate of your efforts and technical expertise into some sort of actionable soundbite for management or for whoever your deliverable is going to, right? So you can have the best spreadsheet in the world that's doing the fanciest things, but maybe that's not how you should be spending your time at all. Maybe you should be spending it talking to those other departments in the company to figure out what problems you can help them solve, what roadblocks you can help them, remove. And I think that when finance folks get excited about going deep into modeling, there's nothing wrong with that fundamentally, but I think it's important to contextualize it and to understand that again, not losing sight of the bigger picture, your goal in doing some things in exercise like modeling or other types of ad hoc analysis is to actually get some insight out on the other end that you can then take to one of the departments in your company and help them improve a process or help them develop a better strategy or approach. And so, yeah, I agree. I mean, sure, you need some understanding of finance if you're in that role. Ultimately, though, uh, especially as technology progresses and we get better and better tools, hopefully that abstracts away a lot of that legwork that the finance person is doing anyway. And so then the focus is even more on, okay, now that I've freed up a bunch of my time because I have better tools at my disposal, how do I then communicate the insights more effectively to actually move the needle on the trajectory of the company?
Mm. And I guess it comes down to the way that you describe it as well, and as you say there about focusing on the message that needs to be communicated is, you know, finance business partner is only a step away from, I guess, broader business partners. So how do you define it? Is it predominantly a finance business partner that's focusing solely on finance information and communicating, or is it a business partner that is also finance savvy? You see what I mean? And
I do.
you can't answer the question without understanding the sort of business and the goals. But so again, another loose definition for people to decide whether they do or don't want to get into the camp of anybody can be a finance business partner. But there we
No,
go.
but I think it is part of a kind of uh, a broader perspective of looking at the finance role and how it's changing, right? Especially with technology. Uh, Overall, you may not even be spending your time wisely doing modeling, right?
Mm,
Regardless of the tool, spreadsheet, my tool, any tool out there, it may not be a good use of your time depending on the size and the maturity of the company, right? If you're really early on, and I tell prospects this even a lot of the time, if they're under, call it 500K in ARR, um, you can use my tool. You're not going to get as much value out of it as if you were already at a few million in ARR. It may still be valuable, and you may still need it for your board meetings or for investor calls, but ultimately don't spend too much time and uh, don't kind of overemphasize the outputs of that model because it may not be relevant in another 6 months, right? And so you want to minimize the time that you're spending on an activity like that because maybe there are other parts of the business that you should be working on and focusing on, right? Maybe for the finance business partner, they should be working more closely with marketing to help understand their marketing ROI on their ad spend, right?
yeah.
And that may be infinitely more valuable than being heads down in a financial model for the business um, at different stages in a company's life cycle. So that's another thing to take into account. The act of uh, kind of modeling in and of itself um, is not valuable unless it leads to some actionable insight, assuming that that's the right time and place to go through that exercise. And, again, if the company is early enough, you should probably be spending your time doing something else.
Yeah. Especially, uh, you know, younger companies that are growing quickly, the amount of variables and potential for change in the early stages of a company's growth would be, I think, incredibly difficult to build into a financial model just because there are so many unknowns at that stage. So I'd agree what you're saying there. And coming back to your point about sales and marketing aligned with finance, really interesting conversation with Chris Ortega, um, where we got into the weeds quite heavily about that sort of customer acquisition cost and all that sort of stuff. Um, so yeah, 100%. You need to pick your battles at the end of the day, don't you?
Yeah.
But it's good. You probably win more business by saying to people it's the wrong time. Come back in 6 months because then you trusted. You're not just pushing a product, are you? You're actually looking at their goals and making sure that it's the right fit rather than something that's not going to generate that value. So
Yeah. I think it's better for everyone, right? If I think that a prospect is a little bit too early on to get real value out of FlowCog, I may explain to them, hey, it's not that the product won't work for you. come back in 6 months, it's going to work a lot better for you. Or if you want to set it up now, we can talk about maybe a discount or something. But ultimately, you want to be careful with how you're spending your time overall. And if you can spend a minimal amount of time using my product and get a result from it, great. But you really do need to understand that at different stages in a company's life cycle, modeling's usefulness is going to fluctuate, right? It's going to vary, and yeah, ultimately, it saves both me and the other party time if I can tell them, hey, I I would love if you gave me money right now for my product, but ultimately, I don't think either of us it's going to be a good use of our time
Yeah.
because if you're unhappy with it and it's not actually giving you value, uh, you're going to end up churning anyway. And
Mhm.
so I've invested the time in getting you set up with the product, even though a lot of it is automated, and I've gotten it down to a pretty short amount of time in terms of onboarding. It's still not a good use of both of our times, right? So if I can save them time and help them understand upfront what the expectation is, I think everyone is just better off overall.
So you mentioned there, you just put the figure out there, 500K ARR, which is an annual recurring revenue, right?
Mhm.
Leads me to a point that wasn't on the list of questions that I sent across. Obviously, you've decided to focus quite heavily in SaaS, so SaaS modeling. Is there a reason that you specifically went down that SaaS route as opposed to just creating a, a modeling tool that had wider applications?
Yeah, this gets back to what we were talking about before about low code tools and the difficulty of having someone either learn a new tool or inherit a model and learn all of the kind of building blocks and the kind of atomic units of it from scratch. I think that at least for modeling for SaaS companies, it should be a lot more automated and you shouldn't need to spend that much time going through that, right? Because there are a few kind of fundamental principles when it comes to modeling SaaS companies and where the emphasis should be. So once you narrow the tools kind of industry down to just SaaS, you can get pretty um, automated and opinionated about the structure of the product and what that looks like from the customer's perspective. So instead of showing them all of the guts of the product, which they can see if they dig deep enough in different parts of it, a lot of that is kind of purposely tucked away. The idea is that they should be able to see the inputs into a model that are relevant to them, enter them in with making sure that they understand the inputs and giving them enough documentation and resources to really come up with good estimates. Um, and then on the other end of it, to get actual insight out and to not have to be able to do that whole journey and to minimize the amount of time that it takes, right? So the kind of more narrowly focused in terms of the industry your product doesn't just go for financial modeling tools. It goes for a lot of tools out there. You see this with CRMs these days. A lot of uh, there's kind of this move more toward vertical SaaS companies where they're serving a particular niche, and
Sure.
their tool ends up being more useful because the product is not as flexible. It is more opinionated. Doesn't mean there's no flexibility in some of these CRMs, but because they know that they're a CRM for barbershops, they can abstract away a bunch of the kind of legwork that a user would need to do to get up and running with their product, right? Um, so that's what I've tried to do with FlowCog is to make it so specific to SaaS companies. And this is another area where I will actively turn down a prospect if I kind of shortly into our conversation realize that they're not a true SaaS company with recurring revenue.
Mm.
That breaks a lot of fundamental assumptions, and they should go and use another product because FlowCog is so specific to SaaS companies that even coming down to what the P&L looks like, right? It's going to be very opinionated. I don't let users add or remove line items from the P&L. There's
Mm.
actually two P&Ls. One of them is a more detailed one that gets allocated into a SaaS formatted P&L. SaaS formatted P&L is 5 or 6 line items: revenue, cost of revenue, sales and marketing, R&D, G&A, and that's it. And that's because that's how the entire industry does it. You need to
Mm.
fully allocate your expenses between your cost of revenue and your operating expenses. The reason for that is because a lot of those metrics that people want to see, your gross margin, your lifetime value of a customer to customer acquisition cost ratio, uh, burn multiple, rule of 40, things like that. Um, you want those to be comparable to other SaaS companies, both public and private. And
Right.
so there are just some definitions that have emerged over time in terms of what those metrics, how you calculate them, and the kind of P&L format that you need to be able to calculate those reliably. And so for SaaS companies, if their tool is not giving them the output in that format, when they go to do their comparisons or benchmarking or anything like that, it's not going to be as relevant. It's going to be apples to oranges. And so you want to give the user the kind of best fitting product and result for their particular use case or company that you can. And it's hard to do that if you have a more generalized tool. And I would include spreadsheets in that as well, right? You can think about it in terms of degrees of freedom. How much flexibility is there with the most fundamental building blocks of this tool? With a spreadsheet, it's nearly infinite, right? It
Mhm.
has so many degrees of freedom because you could do anything in a spreadsheet. Uh, but the problem also is that you can do anything in a spreadsheet, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that can lead to a lot of issues. You all of a sudden have to reinvent the wheel and start to think about data structures and everything. And if that's not your full-time job and you should also be spending your time elsewhere,
Yeah.
it's going to take you that much longer to get to uh, a point in time where the thing that you've built is actually serving you and giving you more insights back than kind of the data that you're feeding into it.
Mhm. And it's interesting, and I'm very keen to see how things progress. So a lot of my experiences with sort of I guess more mainstream ERP systems like your Microsofts and your Sages and your SAPs and that sort of stuff. And of course, there's been a big shift recently as they took old style on prem systems and they've moved them into their own SaaS platforms, whether it's on Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, whatever it happens to be. But what's interesting is obviously now that they've got data, huge volumes of data in public infrastructure, i.e., multi-tenant shared server environments. When anonymizing data, these big providers can start analyzing trends, and some stuff that I've heard floated about is the concept of stuff like GL as a service, and all of those sorts of things. And it's exactly what you're saying there. So your tool, because it's SaaS focused, will only have one structure because it is industry best practice to have this structure. It's what everybody else is doing. So it takes that thought process out of it. I think we're going to see a shift with that in more mainstream solutions, not from a forecasting perspective, but from a general accounting perspective, not just in the enterprise space, which is really a little bit where that's, I think, going to be aimed to begin with. But in the SME market, wouldn't it be ace if you logged onto a Xero or a QuickBooks or whatever the platform is, you entered your industry, and immediately it just came back based on best practice from other industries, how to structure your accounts? And somebody might correct me, and please, if anybody's hearing this and they know of any of the smaller solutions that are giving a preset industry chart account, for example, based on live data, I'm not talking just a pre-canned format based on something that developed 10 years ago. I'm talking about shared data from public infrastructure. So I think that's definitely the way that the market's going. The end result is time savings, obviously, being able to share best practices without having to go through that 10,000 hours piece that we've been talking about today, right?
Exactly. And a couple companies come to mind for on the accounting side of things. One of them is called Nix Sheets. I know that they're doing some interesting things when it comes to kind of automating the accounting journey. Another one called SaaS Ant. They do something similar. But I do think that that's the direction that we're trending, right? If you have a big enterprise product and you're a multi-billion dollar company and you see all of your customers doing something over and over in the same way, there's a good chance that when you combine that with like best practices in the industry, you can come up with some sort of layer of intelligence that you should be delivering back to the user or to a new user when they start to use your software to say, hey, you should be setting up your chart of accounts in this way. Don't add this account because you're going to end up removing it later because that's what 1,000 companies that we've seen and that have started to use our accounting product have done. They start off with these chart of accounts, they converge to this set of chart of accounts. And I think ultimately it's not trying to shoehorn everyone into a one size fits all solution, which is where kind of the niching down comes into play. As long as it's kind of industry specific and it serves those customers well, and there are, kind of shared principles across different companies or business structures in um, for that industry, then I think it lends itself well to something like this. Um, I don't know if I would call it AI necessarily, but this general idea that when you are setting up and implementing a new system, whether it's an ERP or accounting system, whatever, uh, you should get a lot of help with that. You shouldn't have to go out and read a bunch of resources on the best way to set up this product, right? That product should give you a lot of the intelligence of previous users of that product, or in general, best practices from that injury, in the best case scenario, both of those. And you should really be guiding the user through that journey of implementing or onboarding in that way, right? So it's almost like I think of the concept of bowling with bumpers. And so you're not just out there,
Yeah.
bowling
Yeah.
for the first time and you're gonna throw the ball in the gutter every time. You have bumpers on both sides that say, no, 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 like you may want to reconsider how you're doing this thing and maybe do it this other way, right? So
I
yeah,
love
I think that
the
that's
bumpers. I love that.
yeah. I think that eventually we will see a lot more of that, and I think that's the kind of progression. What it means to write good software is like how much does the user need to think and reinvent for themselves, or go and hunt down the answer somewhere else, and how easy is it for them to just get up and running with the tool? The tool feels intuitive to use, and they're getting kind of feedback or insight from the product itself that tells them, hey, do things this way, don't do things this way. And so I think that's where, again, the niching down comes into play. It's really hard to make those suggestions if you're just a general purpose tool. And don't get me wrong, you can imagine, let's take spreadsheets, for example. There are still, even though it's a tool with infinite degrees of freedom, right? You can do anything in a spreadsheet. There are still best practices for writing formulas, not hard coding numbers inside formulas, things like that, right? And so you can imagine a world where Google and Microsoft over time, they start to build in that level of intelligence into their tools, and they say, hey, Clippy pops up and says, hey, we
Yeah.
noticed that you just hard coded a number in a formula. We recommend against that for these reasons. Here are some resources if you want to learn more about it. Oh, and by the way, here's a better way to write the formula that you're writing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know that there have been some AI tools that have popped up to help with, um, writing Excel and Google Sheets formulas. I just think that we'll see more of that over time, and it won't be something as disjointed from the product experience itself, where you'll have to go to a side panel and say, hey, write me the formula for this. The tool itself will know. And when you go to write a spreadsheet formula, it'll know, hey, you're not doing this in a way that industry experts would recommend, spreadsheet experts would recommend, right? There's a better way to do it.
And it will come. It will come with more data. There's a couple of examples there, but I think we're still very much in suggestion territory, i.e., high level suggestion rather than prescriptive. No, you want to be doing it this way. So the two examples, and you mentioned one there, Google Sheets, right? So for my work, I use Microsoft. For my personal and my business, I use Google Sheets. It's just I'm not greedy. It's just that for whatever reason, my Gmail email, started using Drive, and then it just evolved from there. And obviously work has always been Microsoft. But I was doing some calculations on Google Sheets, and it started doing just that. I've seen it before with Excel. It's that, you start writing a formula, like a sum, and it'll look at the spreadsheet and say, oh, because you've started writing this, we can assume that you want to sum the total of the columns above. And that's why it's suggestion rather than this is best practice, because it's just inferring from, I guess, a common set of interactions that it has. The other thing that I saw recently that was quite cool, wasn't to do with spreadsheets or finance or anything like that, actually in HubSpot. So obviously HubSpot as a CRM tool, again, has been in the cloud, I don't know how long, but a long time. And they are working from a shared infrastructure. And we got a pop-up the other day with an email that somebody had incorrectly entered. And HubSpot wouldn't allow us to message using that email because it said HubSpot has reported a high volume of bounces to this email by other companies. So again, this is kind of hints at what's to come, I guess, and it's nice to see. But the thing is, to most people that are just using these systems day to day, it's kind of, oh, that's nice. That's pretty cool. They don't necessarily understand the stuff that's going on in the background. I think we'll be in a position pretty soon. Another podcast gets that I can give away because it's not released yet. He is forecasting that the next step away from the likes of ChatGPT, where at the moment it's still very prompt orientated, write a better prompt, get a better result. The future is even further than low code. It's almost as if just do stuff without thinking about it. And then you'll have all of this platform in the background that's supporting your actions without you even knowing it. So I think that is definitely, and then we're all obviously into that territory of, human versus machine. Are we a hybrid? Are we half robot? All of that sort of stuff. But I'm fascinated by this stuff.
Yeah, it's really interesting, this kind of concept of uh, autocomplete, or have an AI kind of guess the next word or the next action that should be done in the form of a suggestion, right? And uh, hopefully the UX of a lot of software over time evolves to the point where things are happening in the background that the user is not aware of, and it's exactly in line with their intuition and expectations. And like the HubSpot example is perfect, right? HubSpot should never let you send an email to an email address that they know has a super high bounce rate, right? That's easily avoidable. You don't need AI for that. That's you know, simply store that in a database somewhere, and HubSpot should be able to do that and retrieve that when the user goes to send something, and immediately just surface that intelligence, right?
Yeah.
But you see this kind of autocomplete too with GitHub Copilot, which is I absolutely love it. I think it's a fascinating product. It's right most of the time, and if you know how to uh, kind of prompt it, it does but two things, right? You can prompt it by writing a comment in your code base to say, hey, select this item if it has this attribute from this list of objects, right? In to give a programming example, it'll go and write the code out based on the rest of your the code in your code base, or in that particular file, and it does a very good job of it. I'm extremely impressed by the kind of not only the ability for Copilot to come up with an answer at all, but then to come up with a very performant, or a snippet of code that actually executes in an efficient way as well. So I've had a really good experience with it. Some may disagree with me, but if you know how to prompt it by writing in a comment saying, "Hey, I need you to do X, Y, Z," there's a good chance that Copilot's going to be able to deliver on that. And then even separate from that, it'll know if depending on the kind of structure of your code, what the kind of next line of code could potentially look like. And again, these are suggestions, but for VS Code and GitHub Copilot being integrated into it, for instance, to be such a kind of a tool with so many degrees of freedom, right? You can write any sort of code in a text editor like that. to still be able to deliver value based on this kind of automatic recognition of the context that you're building the software in. That's what allows it to then say, "Hey, this is a really likely or high probability snippet of code that you'll probably need next. Here's our suggestion." Um,
Do you know what technology is being used in the background?
yeah, it's GPT-3.
So it is,
Um,
it is
yeah,
GPT. Okay, fine. So they've just done what the various other developers have done, and they said, look, this is my prompt language. Effectively, this is the data to look at. When somebody asks you this, then bring back this response, right? Okay.
yeah, and I'm sure it's some sort of super custom implementation of it and lots of fine tuning and there's this layer of being able to get feedback from the user when they either take the suggestion that Copilot has offered up or they reject it and say no, I needed something else. So there is that nice feedback loop that they get as well, which is incredibly important when it comes to collecting data to then feed back into these machine learning algorithms.
Staying on the topic of GPT-3, I haven't been able to get into it for like 2 weeks now because the demand for it. So I have clicked the button to say I'm interested in premium. For whatever reason, not available in the UK. I don't know whether you've got the pro version in the US yet. Has it come out?
It has, yeah.
That's right. Okay, so I'm still I'm on the wait list, but either way. But no, coming back to you and what you've been, because you were one of the first that I saw on LinkedIn, I think it was, to start building GPT-3 into your solution. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Obviously, we've talked about having low code options to build financial models and forecasts. What's the advantage of building in, I suppose, additive AI, which is what we're saying there, to a forecasting tool?
There's kind of a couple approaches to this. Again, kind of the North Star here is this time to value for the user, not just when they first open up your product, whatever software product it is, doesn't need to be a modeling tool. Any piece of software, right? When they are engaging in it, not just for the first time, but when they pop open a browser window and they go to your app, and they're looking for a specific answer, how do you get them that answer as soon as possible, right? So, for instance, uh, maybe the way the data presented in a tool doesn't do all of the kind of infinite permutations of the calculations of year over year growth or quarter over quarter growth for different quarters or aggregating different line items and then doing the comparison, right? You can imagine that the tables or dashboards would grow infinitely large if you tried to capture all of that data in one spot. So you should have some sort of assistant or a helper to be able to ask a question in plain English and say, "Hey, uh, I don't want to go digging for the answer of how this variable or how this line item changes over time. What does it look like? Where's the inflection point in its trajectory? What makes up that number?" And so you should be able to ask a question in plain English and get a response back that has a combination of, "Oh, okay, well, we know what you're looking for because we've gathered enough context both from the product itself and what you've prompted us, us being the AI here." And it should be able to go in and return a result that's a combination of English words on the page with numbers in kind of easily understandable fashion, right? And that's the goal, is to not require that everyone using your tool is an absolute expert that spent 10,000 hours in that field, right? You want software tools that are easy enough to use that deliver you insight back, um, as long as you can give the AI a halfway decent prompt at what you're looking for, right? And it's really cool to see because, like, even in FlowCog, if you are using the AI feature to ask it a question about your projections or even your historical results that are in the tool, you can misspell words. You can, come up with uh, there's a lot of room for error when it comes to you asking the AI a question and the AI being intelligent enough to understand it and actually answer the question that you were really asking. Um, and so as long as you can kind of implement something like a GPT-3 or ChatGPT in the right way for your product, um, you can have it be pretty specific with the responses that it gives so that it's doing enough explaining so that the user, uh, it's not as much of a black box for the user of how the AI arrived at an answer. You can tell it, hey, I need you to show your work, right? So that's what I kind of did with FlowCog is I made sure every time it gives someone an answer, oh, how did your gross margin change in your projections going from, the year 2024 to 2026, something like that. Uh, it'll say, hey, it went from, a gross margin of 75% to 82%. And the reason it did that is because these line items changed over time. And the reason it did that is because these inputs have these compounding effects in there that will change these outputs in the model, right? So you want to be able to kind of give that insight overall. And you also, in theory, and eventually this is where I would like to take FlowCog, to be able to do that, but also to kind of integrate it more closely with the experience of when you're using the product itself, right? So not just for querying um, outputs, but also for explaining to the user, hey, you should be focusing on these inputs. Hey, these uh, inputs or this kind of idea of like sensitivity analysis or what if analysis, goal seek, things like that. Um, Being able to kind of take your set of data and assumptions that you've entered into the product, synthesize some sort of insight and surface that to the user and say, hey, you should really be focusing on this in your business because out of all of the inputs that you've entered, um, no matter how efficiently your marketing spend gets, your conversion rate to go from an opportunity to an onboard customer is so bad that it doesn't matter how well your marketing team is doing. Ultimately, the bottleneck is your conversion rate here.
Mhm.
So a tool like FlowCog should be able to eventually surface these insights to the user and to steer them in the right direction of what to spend their time on, right? So that's kind of the ultimate overarching goal of this is to be able to uh, answer a question that the user doesn't know they have, right? And so this gets back to the idea of not having the user or not needing or requiring the user to be an expert and to have this uh, expert level intuition on what they need to dive deeper into to be able to surface that for them that I think is ends up being really powerful and saves the user a bunch of time. And again, this whole equation of how much time and effort and expertise are you putting into your tool? How much are you getting back out on the other side? So making sure that kind of that equation is very favorable for the user, I think is uh, again, that's why it's my kind of North Star, making sure that they get those insights quickly and easily and without needing to come up with the perfect question to ask the tool.
And how far do you think we'll be able to take it? I know sometimes this is a bit pie in the sky stuff, right? But let's say that you've got 3-4 years worth of data in FlowCog or whatever the tool is, to the point where we can build up a pretty good picture of performance and how stuff has changed based on variables A, B, and C, how close we were to predicted scenarios A, B, and C, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, coming back to the point that I mentioned earlier about unknown unknowns, when I first got access to ChatGPT, I lost my Christmas to it, by the way. I'll be loving that to it. I was chatting quite a lot to ChatGPT, and I was asking questions like, what effect would a global pandemic have on the profitability of a company in the manufacturing and distribution space, for example? So I was trying to be as awkward and as complicated as I could
Yeah.
possibly
Yep.
be, as I think a load of people. I mean, I was trying to get constructive. I think a lot of people just tried to break the machine and ask silly questions. As I said, I didn't get down that rabbit hole, but I did try and test the limit of usable information that would come out of it. And of course, it came back with the standard Well, it could be this, but you've got
Yeah.
to bear in mind this, being that politically correct, not wanting to actually make a recommendation and just put some information out there. But going back to the question, so let's say that we've got 3 or 4 years worth of data. How far away do you think we are off being able to ask whatever the AI is in the system? How do you think our profitability is going to be affected by a recession or by a pandemic? Do you think we're going to be able to get to those sorts of answers, or do we still think that that's quite a way away?
I think probably in the next year or two. I know for my specific case with FlowCog, I think it'll come a little bit sooner. Again, I have the advantage, double-edged sword, right? I have a smaller target market
Yeah.
just focusing on SaaS companies, but it does allow me to get more specific then with how I'm implementing something like GPT-3 to give the user um, an answer that at least has more narrow context to it. And so then you can kind of direct the AI to return different sets of parameters. So instead of just giving a general response of, oh, we think it may affect profitability in this way, or it could affect profitability in that way. It really depends on how it all plays out. You can get it more to give you a more detailed answer by saying, okay, um, GPT-3, when you give the response to the user when they ask how something is going to affect the profitability, first take into account what the inputs of the model are and how those are related to the substance of their question, and then give them this kind of range of outcomes, Monte Carlo analysis, sensitivity analysis, so you can see how changing a few of these inputs in the model, either isolated changes or in tandem with one another, are going to affect the outcome and how much it shifts the curve. And then you should also explain that to the user as well and say, hey, we think that it may affect profitability by XYZ percent. And we got that by changing these variables by this degree. And hopefully still, of course, give the caveat, this will vary based on your
Yeah.
company and what, even if you are a SaaS company, uh, not all SaaS companies are identical to each other. So, of course, you want to give that caveat. But uh, I think the kind of the takeaway from that is, as long as you can get the more specific you can get with the context that you're giving the AI, the better answer you're going to get, the more useful or actionable answer you're going to get. So, if you, I don't know, let's make up an example. Let's say that you're a manufacturing company and you're, I don't know, you do a lot of business at a port and that port gets flooded. Um, the AI that you're using should be able to deliver a response that says, okay, well, taking into account how long it's going to take the flood to get cleaned up and all of the damage that it's done, if it takes X number of weeks, your inventory will be backed up by this much. You'll have this much extra carrying costs. You won't be able to, you'll have delays in terms of your cash collections because you won't be able to invoice the client as soon. So it should be able to kind of give a detailed explanation of kind of this cascading set of effects. Um, but again, that's only if the tool has the specific context of what manufacturing companies look like, how they behave, what are the external factors that affect companies like this. So I'm not an expert in the manufacturing industry, so
Yeah. Yeah.
I may have butchered explanation, but I think you get the point. Um, there's, I think over time as AI tools get better and are more integrated into the products that we use, I think that context will be there. Or hopefully the developers that are implementing these models will do it in a kind of uh, smart enough way so that the user is actually getting some sort of actionable insight out from it.
And I think that's the biggest limitation at the moment, coming back to the whole sort of question about prompt engineering. And obviously people are joking that, there'll be full-time prompt engineers pretty soon. I'm hoping that's not the case because I'd like it to get to the point
Yep,
where the AI does see the context. So it
exactly.
can already infer a lot of what you're already asking it. So the example I gave was I use Notion, which is great. It's my to-do list and my pad all in one affiliation. So I don't get any kickback if I recommend it, but it's free, it's easy to use. But that is my brain. That's my virtual brain at the moment. And there's hundreds of pages worth of, book notes from my reading. There's customer conversation notes in there. There's all sorts. So if I were to plug Notion in something like ChatGPT, it already understands my language and the context. So I think we're talking about the same things there. It's about the ability to fill in the gaps without you having to be overly prescriptive on the question that you ask it.
Exactly. Yeah. You nailed it. And I think and don't get me wrong, I think there are place for prompt engineers at some point in down the rabbit hole in terms of how close you are to, fine tuning the model itself. But
Yeah.
certainly I think it's a lazy approach to put the onus on the user to all of a sudden become a prompt engineer, right?
Yeah.
Just like I think it's lazy to, if you have a tool, doesn't need to be a modeling tool, but if you're asking a user to do something really complex and learn something from the ground up and, hey, write this complex Excel formula in order to get the insight that you need. Um, Not that the folks that build Excel are lazy in that because they've built a tool that has those degrees of freedom and that's the expectation of when you use it. But eventually you want to get to the point where you're using software that doesn't put the onus on the user to bring this expertise to the table. And it, assuming that it has that context, should be able to, like you said, from a very basic or maybe even overly simplistic prompt from the user, be able to interpret the real question there or kind of the crux of it and to deliver some sort of more intelligent response.
That's it. And I'll use a really simple example. I mean, it's simple in as simple as I can get it, I guess. But what I did is I built ChatGPT into Google Docs. Yeah. So again, I'm not a developer. I basically stole some code off GitHub. I went into Google Docs. I did what was it called? The integrations or something. I can't remember the button. But anyway, opened up the panel. I pasted it in, and then I just changed the prompt. But the theory was that I could just select the text in the document, click on the prompt, and get ChatGPT to carry out the action on the small amount of text that I'd selected. So the theory was take a podcast transcript like we're having right now. It's an hour's worth of conversation. It could be so many pages of A4 in terms of text. And what we've got, because we're human, is filler words. We've got we've got repeat words. We've got all of that sort of stuff. So a major headache of mine is taking that transcript and actually making it readable. And tools like Descript that we were discussing before we started recording make it easier, but they're still not perfect. Yeah, and you've got to pay for the really expensive platform if you want to get the clever, AI that takes out all of the repeat words and all of that sort of stuff. So I just haven't done it. So I thought if I could get ChatGPT to basically remove all of the filler words and stuff from my transcript, hey, I'm winning, right? I don't have to pay for the hefty Descript subscription. And I've got a bot that's working for me. And I started the prompt, and I can't remember exactly what I put, but I said, act as though you are an audio transcription service. You are to take this text, remove words like as well as repeat words. Now, obviously, because the instruction wasn't good enough, it ended up removing repeat words that weren't in the same sentence or next to each other. Great. I then had to change the prompt to say, remove repeat words that are next to each other, and then that are next to each other separated by a comma. Do you see what I mean? And immediately I had a prompt was a paragraph, 2 paragraphs long. And the results that it produced by the end of the exercise into that large prompt were actually worse than the initial prompt I'd given it just to do a bit of a tidy up. So the point that I'm making there is you can lose hours to trying to develop a decent prompt just down to the iteration process. So I caved in and I said, well, for the podcast I need to get out, I'm just going to pay Go Transcripts. It's 40 quid an hour, and if I'd done it, I would have saved myself at least 2 hours of the prompt engineering. Do you see what I mean? So you've got to pick your battles. I've gone off on a bit of a rant now. I'm sorry, but it's all related.
No, it is. And this kind of loops back into what we were discussing before is that um, you don't want the user, you in this case, to need to come up with, oh, and make sure that the word is next to each other when you remove the duplicate. Don't just remove it if it's shown up 5 paragraphs above it.
Yeah.
You don't want the user to have to come up with all of that internal logic. Hopefully you want the tool to be able to do that automatically. Um, and it's hard to do that because there's a lot of guesswork involved for that tool to say, okay, well, what is Adam really looking for
Yeah.
here? In the same way that in this example, um, if you had software doing this for you and they were thoughtful about implementing something like GPT-3 here, you actually would want to also, uh, without the user needing to prompt the software, deliver the finished product in a way such that it's not even removing and applying the rule for every single filler word, because then you don't want the video transcription or the audio transcription to look or sound too choppy,
Yeah.
right? And so you do want this kind of intelligence and judgment calls, hopefully that the AI can make to say, okay, this was an or an that took 3 seconds long. Yes, remove that. Oh, but if it's below this, and we just removed an or an within 5 seconds of this snippet playing, don't remove it, right?
Mm.
So you want these rules to be auto generated. You don't want the user every time to reinvent the wheel and all of a sudden need to become an expert in how human language sounds to the ear and what makes it sound natural, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully the tool can abstract that away for the user and can handle those set of conditions or rules.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. Well, it's exciting to see where it's going to go, isn't it? And I'm excited to see how FlowCog develops. So we've gone over time already, but I will, if you've got a few minutes, just ask the questions that I always like to ask at the end of these sessions. And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
you can tell people how to find out more about FlowCog. So obviously we talked a lot about tech in terms of modeling, ChatGPT, obviously, which is a bit done to death. It's an interesting topic, so I'm happy to keep talking about it. But the question is whether it's in your work or your personal life. I mean, you mentioned the GitHub autopilot, which obviously is quite cool for you. But is there an Apple piece of software you just couldn't live without?
I GitHub Copilot is definitely up there for me.
Yeah.
I would say my second monitor is pretty useful.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's a good one. My trusted Microsoft Ergonomics 4000 keyboard is my companion. It truly understands me. Yeah, I would say those things. A good enough microphone, hopefully.
Yeah.
Hope it's coming through okay. That's a good one. But yeah, in terms of software, I would say I use Trello a lot. I absolutely love Trello. I think it's an amazing tool. I do use Notion as well for a few things. I do really enjoy navigating and storing information in Notion. A couple other ones, but yeah, I would say I think the one that stands out is um, delivering that magical moment to me consistently is GitHub Copilot.
Yeah.
To be able to see it over and over deliver, and it doesn't mean that it gets it right every time, but I know that if I have a task that I have mapped out in my head well enough, I know that I'll be able to save a bunch of keystrokes
Mm.
and not have to type out the 10 lines of code that are going to be generated. I know that I can ask uh, GitHub Copilot to produce that code, and there's a good chance it'll deliver.
Yeah.
So it's hard to find something else that is comparable to that, just because of how amazing it is to see a tool kind of intuit what you're looking for, right?
We're in that territory, and again, we are a bunch of nerds, aren't we? Where it's actually rewarding to have these systems feedback. It's bizarre, isn't it? It's yeah, but no, I totally agree. The stuff that you can actually see the results pretty much immediately is the cool stuff, right? You know,
Yeah.
completely agree with that. And somebody else mentioned to me as well that Notion have got their own version of ChatGPT that they're building in from a generative point of view, which I still haven't switched on yet. Maybe
I have,
with three
yeah.
podcasts later, and I still haven't switched on.
Yeah, I haven't tried that one out yet, but I'd be interested too.
Yeah. And you monitor your extra monitor. Do you have it portrait so you can fit in like thousands of lines of code, or are you just
Uh,
you stand?
no, I have a standard setup side by side.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah.
And for anybody that's obviously not a developer and familiar with developer community, I've worked with quite a lot of companies when you go into the developer room, and they've got a widescreen monitor that's tilted 90 degrees on its axis, so that they can fit in more lines on the same screen without having to scroll horizontal. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, no, or if you have the command prompt up or terminal, can
Yeah,
see what's going on. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. So, where can people find out more about you or FlowCog? I'll put a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes, but where else can people find you?
Yeah, so flowcog.com, FlowCog on LinkedIn, Adam Tzagournis, CPA on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter as well, not as active as I am on LinkedIn, but those are the main spots to find.
Very good. And you've got your hair tied up today. People find you on LinkedIn. You'll see some long flowing, luscious locks on the old LinkedIn profile, right?
Absolutely.
I used to have ringlets down to my shoulders when I was in. No, I do miss it. I miss it quite a lot. And just so people can search your for people on audio, Tzagournis is Tzagournis.
You got it.
Yeah, perfect, excellent. As I say, I'll link everybody up. Oh, you got your hair down now. Just switch screen. I've seen it come back. Very good, very good. So yeah, we'll link up in the show notes. But Adam, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, and hopefully 6-12 months we can have another catch up and we'll see how well FlowCog's doing. Eh?
Absolutely. Really appreciate you having me on, Adam.
Yeah, no worries at all. Thank you.